The 66ers play here exclusively on Superstation KCAA AM 1050.
The Vince Daniels Show.
All right, we're back. 29 after the hour here on the Vince Daniels Show. Wayne Jett is in studio with me, and he is the author of, and I promise not to drop the book this time, of The Fruits of Graft. You won't be able to, the fact is you won't be able to put this book down. It's called The Fruits of Graft. Great Depressions Then and Now. And Wayne's an economist. He's been in the financial sector now for a little over 11 years. And, of course, he's argued a lot of cases for the appellate courts here in California and, of course, the United States Supreme Court, I might add. Okay, Wayne, we've been talking, and some are bound to think, oh, gee, another conspiracy theory book. You mentioned that FDR and the elitist class were somehow benefiting from the crash, and I want you to explain for those who, that have this objection, how could Roosevelt benefit from a depression?
It's a very straightforward thing when you're a financier. The fact is that financiers, those who trade in the markets regularly, benefit the greatest during a crash, not during an economic boom. The crash moves prices very quickly, overnight, very sharply, and you simply have to be in what's called a short position, that is betting that the prices of stocks are going to drop, or bonds, whichever. And particularly today, even more than in the Depression, they have created financial instruments ordinarily called derivatives that permit them to make bets that are just tremendously leveraged, very low cost to get the bets made, and then if you can make the market or be sure the market's going down, the amounts of profits are just tremendous. Then there's particularly the Depression, for example, there's another tremendous way that you profit. First, you've made all of those profits by shorting the market during the crash and multiplying your capital greatly in 1929 and into 1932. With those market prices of stocks then at 2 or 3 cents or a nickel on the dollar, you then use all of your money to buy those companies. For example, J. Paul Getty became the richest man in the world, largely on the basis that he happened to inherit his family fortune about that time. So he had private money, and he said himself at the time, he says, this is like buying $20 bills for $1 apiece, because he was able to see that the oil companies in the country were selling at stock prices that simply priced their oil in the ground at something like 5 cents on the dollar. That was the case in so many assets, and that is why the oligarchs, the aristocracy, what I call the dominant elite of the U.S., wanted the Depression to continue. That's why Roosevelt made sure it continued, because all through the 30s, and as long as the Depression continued, those with the looted money, the great amounts of capital, could buy assets in the United States and all over the world for that matter for very, very low prices. So it allowed them to consolidate wealth even much more greatly than it already was at the time they initiated the Depression.
That's what I want to talk a little bit about, because we've got to putting this in historical perspective. We have to remember that when the crash happened, Roosevelt was not in the White House. It was Hoover at that time.
Yes, and as I said, Hoover signed Smoot-Hawley when it passed by only 2 votes. He admitted in years later that he knew that it was not a good idea, but he went along with it anyway. He even ran for re-election on the basis of continuing the high tariffs. Roosevelt acted as if he supposedly, to some audience, he would say that he was going to roll the tariffs back. That was the traditional Democrat position, but in fact he did the opposite when he got into office. Hoover did one more very bad thing, very bad mistake. He multiplied, not his error, but his wrongdoing in 1932 by proposing and then signing a tremendous tax increase in 1932. the Revenue Act of 1932 quadrupled the lowest tax rate and trebled the highest tax rate. So basically you went from a maximum rate in 1928, actually even in 1931 it was continuing, 25% highest rate, and you go up to something near 70% in 1 year. And in 1932 they had no withholding taxes. Everybody had to go to the bank and get their money out in order to pay the federal taxes, which at that time were all due on March 15th of 33. And that is why we had the run on the banks in early March of 1933. People were going to the banks, having to pull out their money to send it into Washington as federal taxes. So that was the thing that absolutely slam dunk that we were going to have a depression starting from 1932. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in a landslide in November of 1932 to reverse exactly that action. And yet, when he got into office, he did exactly the opposite. He was elected in the landslide to stop the fraud in the markets, to roll back the taxes, and to roll back the tariffs.
So you assert in your book, The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now, which I have the author, Wayne Jett, here this morning in studio. You're asserting that Roosevelt lied. Knowing when he was campaigning, he was a part of something bigger, and he told people the opposite of what he was going to do.
Well, even the people in his brain trust, there were two of them who wrote about him in the late 30s after their experience, or during their experience somewhat. Raymond Moley was one of them. And they agreed he was a complete enigma to them because they would give him their best advice, and they could never tell really what he was going to do until he did it. In fact, Moley said that he was a professional actor, the best he had ever seen. He was capable of providing any kind of persona to the public and assuming any position that he wished with complete persuasion, but it really, they couldn't tell at all whether that was his real view in being working closely with him. Let me give you some of the examples of things that he did. He first started in 1933 by appointing a Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who was strongly for free trade and for rolling back the tariffs. Immediately, Hull started an international conference to roll back those tariffs of Smoot-Hawley, and convened a conference in London, international conference, in June and July of 1933, and was in the process of negotiating those things, and had supposedly the assurance of Roosevelt he had his support. And right at the critical time, Roosevelt makes a radio speech from Washington, D.C., knocking it, well, actually they called it a bombshell back at the time, saying that he had no intention of doing any such thing. He had actually himself promised they was going back to the gold standard, and yet in that radio speech he said, we are going to do what we want to do for the United States, and we are not going to agree to stabilize the dollar with respect to any other currency. Well, when you devalue the dollar, that is the same thing as tariffs as far as trade is concerned. It's a way of tricking others into thinking your currency is worth more than it is. That was the first thing he did. Then, as far as taxes is concerned, Roosevelt raised taxes every year he was in office from 1933 until 1945, except one. That was in 1939, when the Democratic Congress would not pass a tax increase because they had lost over 80 seats in the House of Representatives in the election of 1938. And then as far as fraud in the markets, that was the most deceptive thing that he did, because he acted as if he were putting in place an agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to stop the fraud in the markets. That was an act, and there were two laws passed, one in 1933 that declared fraud to be a federal crime in the securities markets, but it didn't define what fraud was, and it didn't define the penalties. So they passed another law in 34 and set up the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they gave that agency discretion as to where and what to investigate and what to prosecute. It still has that discretion today. And that discretion has been used from the beginning to make certain that the biggest manipulators on Wall Street are never prosecuted or punished. In fact, Roosevelt put Joe Kennedy in charge of the SEC to hire its first staff. He appointed him to the commission, then insisted behind the scenes that Joe Kennedy be the chairman of the SEC so that he could pick the staff. He also appointed Ferdinand Pecora, the man who had been the primary investigator for the Senate in the 1933 and 34 investigations of fraud on Wall Street. But Joe Kennedy was such an antagonist that fought Pecora at every point that Pecora resigned from the commission within 6 months. And Kennedy stayed there to make sure that the people put in place would never prosecute him or any of the other manipulators that were still at the time doing whatever they wanted and being brought to no justice.
So what we end up with is, and we talk a lot about it today, but it was happening, it sounds like it started then, or maybe it was happening in little ways before the 30s, but class warfare.
Well, in fact, it comes at a later point in my book because I think it's important
the groundwork was being laid,
to provide the evidence of what was really done then to make people understand that, yes, there were specific acts, there were a series of specific acts that made certain we would have a Great Depression. And there's no doubt in my mind if those same acts or equivalent acts were done today, we would have another one today. In fact, this concerns me about where we are now because so much of what has occurred since 2007, 2008 is a retracing of the kinds of actions, policies that are clearly designed to cause economic depression are being put in place, and I don't see at the present time that they're being changed in any way that is going to create jobs, as they keep saying, or to otherwise get us out of the economic depression that I think we are currently in.
If any of you have any thoughts on this, please jump online. It's a free call. 888 is the area code, 1-888-909-1050. That's 1-888-909-1050. Now, if you think about it, Wayne, you could see why it's so easy for those today who are perpetrating all this class warfare to do it and get away with it, because the average person, and all this stuff just goes over our heads. So it's like they could do it behind the shadows and keep us average people in the dark while they do what they do and get away with it.
Well, in the 30s, for example, there were certainly people who were very suspicious and some who were calling them out on these things, but they simply were overwhelmed by the power and influence of the federal government as well as the oligarchs, the dominant elite, who have had then and they have today a tremendous influence over the main media, the so-called mainstream media. But let me name another thing or two that Roosevelt did to make certain the Depression would continue. For example, the devaluation of the dollar that he did in January of 1934 was done in conjunction with the seizure of gold, all the private gold that people had bought trying to protect whatever assets they had left after the crash and the Depression and the shutdown of production, shutdown of factories and so forth because they couldn't sell them in the international market and nobody had money to buy them here. The gold seizure was done by ordering that everyone with gold send the gold to, or provide the gold to the Federal Reserve, and they would be paid $20.67 an ounce. As soon as the government got that, then Roosevelt said, all those dollars that we paid you are now going to take $35 to buy an ounce of gold. So the dollars that people had in their savings were then worth 41% less than they were simply the day before. That devaluation, most people think that devaluations are done in order to provide more liquidity to the economy. There will be more currency out there and people can do more business. Roosevelt carefully designed the devaluation of January 1934 so that there would be not one new dollar in the economy. The dollars already there would simply be worth 41% less, and the differing value would be transferred into the treasury of the U.S. government. So it was, in effect, a confiscation of 41% of the, at least the currency wealth, and I think from an economic standpoint, it really transferred in 41% of the value of all assets in the economy. This again did not add any liquidity to the private economy, but take that into account in connection with the high taxes that were being raised every year and what Roosevelt was doing with them. Roosevelt began in the fall of his first year in office, 1933, to use the tax money that they were collecting to buy gold in overseas markets. By November of 1933, he was already buying large amounts of gold in foreign markets. That was taking money out of the United States, bringing gold back in, and it's very important to understand what he was doing with gold. He was sequestering the gold in the U.S. Treasury. It was not being used as the gold standard required. Its primary rule in the gold standard was if you have gold, you are obligated as a nation and government to issue currency in the full amount of the value of the gold. Roosevelt did not permit that. The gold was being hoarded, and therefore there was less money in the world as a whole because he was doing the hoarding. The thing that amazes me, astonishes me, is that during the 1930s, during the most starved, impoverished decade in the history of the country, Roosevelt bought more than twice as much gold as the United States had acquired in all of its previous history. In fact, in 1940, there was more than 19,000 metric tons of gold in the U.S. Treasury, while in 1930, there was only about 6,000 metric tons.
Wayne Jett is with us this morning. We're going to continue here on the other side. We have somebody on the line who wants to talk to you when we come back on the other side. Wayne Jett is the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. It's a fascinating book, which you can get. In fact, I have a link to it on my website, vincedaniels.com, or you can order it through Amazon. We're going to come back in our remaining moments. I have a couple of questions here, and somebody on the line wants to talk to you along this line of conspiracy theory as well. So stick around, Wayne. Great to have you here, and great to have all of you out there and on the phone lines as well. 888-909-1050, 14 to the hour now on The Vince Daniels Show.